Welcome to 20th Century Music and Arts. This is part 2 of my look at the most chaotic and experimental rock bands of the 1960s. In this episode, we're going to look at bands that integrated electronics into their music. The idea of combining music with noise and electronic sounds, mechanical sounds, really goes back to the Italian futurist movement from the early 20th century, with composers like Francisco Balia Pretella and Luigi Russolo. Later on, composers such as Edgar Varese, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, John Cage, and Morton Feldman used various electronic sounds and tape manipulations into their compositions. Now, this would eventually find its way to popular music. Electronic sounds found their way into Good Vibrations by the Beach Boys, for example. Also, bands like Pink Floyd and, of course, the Mothers of Invention integrated these strange noises, tape loops, and electronic sounds into their music. However, in this episode, what we're going to look at 4 bands where the electronic sounds, the mechanical sounds, were a fundamental part of the music. The music that was created here was very innovative and groundbreaking, and none of these bands really got a lot of success during their initial run, but later on people realized they were pioneers in the evolution of electronic music, and by the 1990s they would get praise. Now, the first band on the list is called the United States of America. They started with arranger and composer Joseph Byrd. He had been involved in creating avant-garde compositions. They were very influenced by a composer called Charles Ives. And he was also interested in Indian music and jazz. Now, he visioned a band that would fuse electronic sounds with the kind of psychedelic rock of the day, along with folk, classical, and of course, Indian music, and radical politics. In fact, his idea of calling the band the United States of America was supposed to be kind of a subversive idea, like burning the flag or at least hanging it upside down. He put together this band with Gordon Marron on electric violin and ring modulator, Rand Forms on fretless bass, Craig Woodson on electric drums, and Byrd's former lover and collaborator Dorothy Moskowitz on vocals. Joseph Byrd would handle the electronic sounds and the various keyboard instruments. Now, they would go into the CBS studio in Hollywood in December 1967 to record their self-titled album. Now, this album is incredible. Rather than depending on distorted guitars to create that psychedelic feel, Byrd used a variety of electronic sounds to create this effect. The quality of the sound is surreal, and Moskowitz's vocals, sometimes with the help from Marron as well, they have this ethereal quality, but it makes everything sound sort of 60s, hippish, stylish, space pop kind of sound. These ideas would be later heard in bands like Stereolab, Portishead, Broadcast, and Massive Attack. The sound here is so unique and ahead of its time, but it's of its time as well. You know, usually on these videos I give you highlight tracks, but I think with all the albums here, I'm going to say the whole album is a highlight. You just need to listen to the whole album. So, while the album did not sell well when it was released, it has been praised in recent years, and it's just aged so well. Now, the band could not agree on the vision and broke up a few months after its release, though they did manage to play shows at the Fillmore West with the Troggs and the Velvet Underground. This album revealed the potential of how electronic sounds in the studio could be used to create truly psychedelic music. Again, please check out this album. Now the next group on our list is 50 Foot Hose out of San Francisco. Formed as a trio put together by Cork Markishi with Larry and Nancy Blossom. Initially, Markishi would be on bass, Larry on guitar, and Nancy on vocals. Soon the band would include Kim Kesey on drums and Larry Evans on guitar. Now, Markishi was interested in R&B and even released a weird single with his group Ethics called Bad Trip, which could apparently be played at any speed. This song has like a wild, atonal, tripped out soundscape, and it hinted at what was to come. Now Markishi, or Cork as I'll call him, was both a musician and a sculptor. He was inspired by experimental composers such as Edgar Varese, John Cage, Terry Riley, and George Antheil. He was also inspired by Nikola Tesla, so he had this idea of trying to sculpt energy. And in a sense, that's what he was doing with the sound of 50-Foot Hose, as he was trying to sculpt sound. Now, what made the band different was he put together his own electronic instrument that had a theremin, distortion pedals, a cardboard tube, and a speaker from a World War I bomber. Now, the trio recorded a demo and were signed to Limelight Records in 1967, and they would go on to make one record called Cauldron, which was eventually released in 1968, with Kesey Evans and Terry Hansley on bass joining. Now, again, this album is incredible. You've got psychedelic guitar, strange atonal rhythms, and electronic sounds all intermingled with beautiful vocals and sometimes really strange ones, creating truly out of left field music. In the midst of this chaos, there's actually a cover of Billie Holiday's God Bless the Child, complete with electronic sounds. This album might have been too strange for the hippies of the time, but again, it has aged very well. This was the original band's only release, and they broke up in late 1969. Members joined Hair the Musical, Nancy became the lead in the musical Godspell, and Corky became a famous sculptor. And he did actually put a new version of the band in the 90s with new members. But Cauldron from 1968 was a unique release that was completely ahead of its time. Please check out Cauldron by 50-Foot Hose. Now, for the next album, we're going to go over to the United Kingdom. And the album we're going to look at is a pure electronic sound album. There's not a lot of conventional instruments here. It's really just the manipulations that are happening in the studio. And of course, I'm talking about An Electric Storm by White Noise. Dyla Derbyshire, who worked at the BBC Radio Workshop. Now, you might know her because she would take compositions and create versions of them using electronic sounds. Her most famous piece is Composition by Ron Grainer. And she took that composition and used electronic sounds, and then that composition would be used as the theme for Doctor Who. In 1968, she was giving a lecture, and in the audience was David Voorhees. He's originally from America, and he was a classically trained bass player who had studied physics and electronic engineering. Derbyshire had tried creating a group earlier called Unit Delta Plus in order to create electronic music, but the group fizzled out by 1968. She and her fellow Unit Delta Plus member, Brian Hodgson, decided to join with David Voorhees, and this new project was called White Noise. They would go into the studio to record their first album, An Electric Storm, which was released in 1969. While there is some actual percussion on this album, it's just pure electronic sound and tape manipulation. This album must have sounded like it had come from outer space when it was first heard. You've got strange soundscapes crash into kind of an electronic pop, and there's samples, echo delay, tribal drumming, frightening screams, and even the sounds of sexual arousal on one track. This album is so surreal and cerebral, and it really drills into the listener's imagination. The last track, The Black Mass / An Electric Storm in Hell, was featured in the Hammer horror film Dracula AD 1972. Hodgkins and Derbyshire would leave the band after this album, but Voorhees would continue releasing albums under the White Noise name, with the most recent actually being in 2021. Now please check out An Electric Storm by White Noise. This album is totally and completely ahead of its time. The last band on the list are the Silver Apples. Now, they started out as a band called the Overland Stage Band, and they were in the East Village in New York. The band singer, Simeon Oliver Cox III, who usually just go by Simeon, started using an audio oscillator. It's kind of like a primitive synthesizer to make sounds. Now, the rest of the band got annoyed with this strange noise-making machine being added to their kind of pop music, and eventually the band was just made up of Simeon and drummer Danny Taylor. They now call themselves the Silver Apples, after the second line in the Irish poet W.B. Yeats's poem, The Song of Wandering Aengus. The line, "The Silver Apples of the Moon." Now, interestingly, American composer Morton Subotnick released an album of electronic compositions called The Silver Apples of the Moon in 1967. Now, the band The Silver Apples were signed to Cap Records and released their self-titled debut in 1968. Simeon became friends with a poet named Stanley Warren, who ended up writing lyrics for 7 out of the 10 songs. The sound on this album is great. These are very much straightforward pop rock songs, as opposed to some of the other compositions from the other bands on this list. And they have a live drummer. The difference here is the oscillator is creating all the sounds, and the drummer has to kind of tame and structure those sounds in the songs, along with the pop vocals. Now, the opening song, Oscillations, is an ode to the sounds that the oscillator makes. Now, there's only 2 players here, and so the band sound is very unique. And again, unlike the other groups discussed earlier, this music is very structured, and it's very much around songs and choruses and verses, and the band really focused on replicating those sounds live. John Lennon was apparently a big fan, and he thought the Silver Apples were going to be the next big thing. They had a follow-up album called Contact, released in 1969. Now, while Simeon played a little banjo on the album, the sound is still very much a continuation of the first album. Now, there was a problem here. They got permission to take pictures of the duo in the front cockpit of a Pan Am flight for the cover of the album. But the back cover showed a plane crash, which resulted in legal action from Pan Am, and the album ended up being pulled from stores. Now, they had recorded a third album in 1970, but Cap Records was then absorbed by RCA, and the album just ended up being shelved. And so the duo, they just kind of broke up. However, the band would have a great influence in the subsequent years. The band Suicide would take inspiration from the Silver Apples and put their own spin on using synthesizers in an unconventional rock context. Other bands who took inspiration from the Silver Apples are Portishead, Stereolab, the Beastie Boys, Spiritualized, Beck, and Moby. The band got back together in the 90s. They released the third album they had recorded in 1970, and they recorded 4 more albums. Simeon unfortunately passed away in 2020. The Silver Apples, like the other bands on this list, were way ahead of their time and were massively influential. Now, I really want you to please check out these incredible, innovative bands that have created music that was groundbreaking and has aged well. Without the United States of America, 50-Foot Hose, White Noise, and the Silver Apples, we might not have the sounds of bands like Stereolab or Portishead. All this music was way ahead of its time. Thank you for watching 20th Century Music and Arts. Please like, share, subscribe, and comment. Have you heard any of these albums? Thank you.